When I sat down to write an episode about player characters, I tried to do a bit of research, and what I found was that the writing surrounding role-playing for digital games is kind of awkward. Game studies writing tends to downplay role-playing itself in favor of looking at systems where role-playing happens. For example, here are some passages from the chapter in Salen and Zimmerman's Rules of Play where they define what a game is. Quote, "A game is a system in which players engage in artificial conflict defined by rules that results in a quantifiable outcome." End quote. From there, they bring up role-playing games. Quote, "There are RPGs that de-emphasize power, statistics, and advancement, and instead focus on storytelling and narrative. This form of RPG seems very unlike games as we have defined them." End quote. Basically, the book argues that role-playing by its own as an activity doesn't have a quantifiable outcome, and as a result can't be called ludic play proper. But if an RPG can be beaten, or if we can look at role-playing games in the context of their battle systems, which present encounters that can be won, then we can look at RPGs through the lens of games, because they have a quantifiable outcome. This leaves systems designed to facilitate role-playing itself kind of a blind spot, and that's emphasized by the fact that this is the only real mention of role-playing in the entire book. Quote, "From a social play point of view, when a player enters into the system of a game, that player is given a role to play. By role, we don't mean that the player becomes a character in a story. Rather, we mean that each player has a role in the social network of a game. Role-playing in this context is centered on the nature of a player's relationships being recontextualized within the context and framing of a game. That is, two people who might barely know each other, or might even be friends, can suddenly become enemies actively working against one another when playing a pickup game of basketball. And there's something to be said about the nature of the Magic Circle, and how all games confer a degree of role-playing, but that's not the sort of role-playing I'm interested in talking about here. Also, it's important to note that this book came out in 2003, and a lot has happened in the last almost 15 years, and Eric Zimmerman was quoted as recently as GDC 2019 as saying that systems are actually one of the most restrictive things about modern games. So I don't want to frame this one book as indicative of all thought on the matter, but this line of thinking is out there, and it's pretty pervasive in game studies, at least in my experience. Meanwhile, the research that does focus on role-playing where one steps into a character is largely focused on the sociological nature of role-playing divorced from its nature as media. Indeed, some of these texts posit that the traditional people's history of role-playing games might have a bit of a ludocentric bent to it. Quoting Dr. Sarah Lynn Bauman in her 2010 book, The Functions of Role-Playing Games, quote, "Though historians focus more on the influence of war games and fantasy fiction when explaining the development of RPGs, the loose format of improvisational theater had already begun to spread in popularity. Therefore, the concept of improv more than likely provided a model for the burgeoning new art form emerging at the same time, role-playing games." That book is actually super interesting if you want to look at the sociological aspects of roleplay, as an empathetic exercise, as therapy, as ritual. But it is expressly more interested in roleplaying as a window to our collective unconscious, as how we define roles for one another, and how roleplaying can act as a transformative, experimental, liminal, playful space, but not so much how roleplaying functions as authored media. All of this makes sussing out the nature of player characters and role-playing mechanics in digital games somewhat difficult because there's not much in the way of a cohesive framing for the topic. If I want to talk about players taking on a role or engaging in some sort of identity-altering performance, that research largely ignores the systems which enable people to do that and instead focuses on the sociological aspects of it, the identity transformation itself. Rules and boundaries may enable the ritual and performance of role-playing, but it is the ritual and performance itself that matters in this view, not the systems. If I do expressly want to talk about the design of those game systems that facilitate role-playing, the actual performative, character-driven role-playing part tends to be pushed aside, or at best referred to loosely as expressive play, where the expressions from players themselves matter less than the systems that facilitate them. The discussions in game design circles are less about the performances of players and what they might mean, than how to design a sufficiently wide possibility space for players to explore and play around in. And all of this is super frustrating for someone who, like me, wants to discuss the design of player characters and role-playing in digital single-player computer games. But there are some reasons for this divide. For one, role-playing is, historically, a social activity. If I take on a role in an RPG, that role is validated by the game master and other players observing my performance and responding to it in kind. It is true collaborative storytelling, where a small team of individuals work together to make, if not a traditionally structured narrative, a compelling adventure that they feel that they themselves have been on. But what does it mean to role-play to oneself? validated not by the observation of others, but simply by the joy of creating a character, or empathetically trying to step into someone else's headspace? What does the ritual of giving up your identity and taking on the mantle of another mean if no one is there to witness or validate it? And how expressive can one possibly be in a digital space? In the world of video games, the dungeon master is absent. The possibility space isn't the broad, anything-goes nature of a pen-and-paper role-playing session. In Dungeons & Dragons, you may be able to play a braggart in a tavern. You could see an attractive person at the bar and drunkenly boast of your previous adventures, obliquely referenced in your character bio, and the Dungeon Master could use that as an excuse to get you into a bar fight or have a character approach you with a proposition for a quest. That sort of natural back and forth can't happen in a video game, where the possibility space has to be defined in advance by rigid systems and rules and prepackaged content like writing and voice acting. In a sense, digital single-player role-playing could be seen as something of an aberration, an attempt to fit a round peg into a square hole. So maybe it's best to step back and look at how player characters are used across the board in video games. As with everything I say on this channel that's sort of an overgeneralization, half-researched academic thing, everything I'm about to say you can find some really cool counterexamples to, and none of this is meant to be a rigid ontology with hardline definitions. Games and characters can use more than one of these ideas at once, and this is more of a casual observation to spark discussion or series of musings than anything. All of that said, at the risk of oversimplifying 50-some-odd years of game design and development, historically speaking, I feel like there's sort of two philosophies regarding player characters in video games. That is, there's two broad traditions that generally guide the designs of mechanics surrounding how we define a player character and what their role in a game is, or maybe how a player is supposed to approach their relationship with the player character. First, there are the player character as avatars. These are characters where the player has no strong influence as to who the character is in any way. Think of pretty much any iconic playable video game character from before 2010 or so. Raziel from Soul Reaver, Doom Guy, Mario, Sonic the Hedgehog, Solid Snake, Altair, Duke Nukem, Guybrush Threepwood, Master Chief, Nathan Drake, and Lara Croft are all characters that fit this loose description. When playing the game, you may embody or puppeteer the character and guide them through the game world, but there's a solid line between you, the player, and them, the character. There is nothing you can do that really changes the expression of the character in the text.
We're only temporarily disabling the tower. You need to remove each lens individually. Carefully release the hinges.
These are also usually, not always, but usually, games where the story and gameplay are pretty well divided, allowing the characters to exist in cutscenes and marketing materials, while in-game they more or less just facilitate gameplay by acting as an avatar for your actions. And in that sense they sort of oscillate between being you and being themselves. And because these characters exist independently from you and your in-game self, there's a distance there. If you die in Super Mario Bros., you tend to say, "I died," not "Mario died." Mario is a cartoon plumber who saves princesses by jumping around. That's who he is and what his story is. Mario, the character, is infallible. His story is set. He saves princesses. He defeats Bowser. You, the player, are not infallible. And it was, in some sense, you up on the screen falling down into that pit, failing to tell Mario's story properly, rather than Mario failing to save Peach. Your failure in these games isn't viewed as a legitimate outcome, it's a mistelling of someone else's tale.
But I knew, with a certainty I could not explain, that those winged creatures had a master. The man who had tricked me into opening the hourglass now had his prize. No, that didn't happen. May I start again?
In these games, gameplay feels like it's the domain of the player rather than the character. This can be useful in some games. The Stanley Parable makes delightful use of the player's impish desire to not play along with a set narrative.
When Stanley came to a set of 2 open doors, he entered the door on his left. This was not the correct way to the meeting room, and Stanley knew it perfectly well. Perhaps he wanted to stop by the employee lounge first, just to admire it.
Stanley, the character, goes left, but you, the player, can go any which way you please. But other times it can be harmful to the game. Take Bioshock Infinite, for example. In the opening of the game, the player character, Booker DeWitt, arrives in the Cloud City of Columbia. Once there, he needs to be baptized before entering Columbia proper. Now, the baptism is non-optional. It's the only way into the city, and it triggers a plot-critical cutscene, so there's no way you can skip it. and as a result, some people found this uncomfortable enough to ask for a refund, back before Steam even did refunds. One could read this as extremely empathetic role-playing. After all, earlier in the game, Booker finds a basin with a "Wash Away Your Sins" sign plastered above it, and he responds like this.
Good luck with that, pal.
But I would actually argue the opposite, that because it was the player that had to push the button to initiate and accept the baptism, and because it was done in first person, and because religious content can be so personal, and because Booker is a scripted character that we've only known for 5 minutes, there really wasn't an insulative fictive barrier between Booker DeWitt and the player to make it his action and not yours. To some, this scene felt tantamount to the game asking them to commit to a virtual baptism, and I think it has to do with the fact that Booker DeWitt only really exists in cutscenes. And it's not just the player's actions and gameplay that can be impacted by how you approach a player character. Keeping this distance between player and protagonist can be a useful storytelling tool. I think this is actually critical in games like The Last of Us, Spec Ops: The Line, God of War, or yes, even BioShock Infinite. Games where the player character's actions need to be questioned. By ensuring a line in the sand between the actions and personality of the player character and the in-game actions of the player character can be portrayed as flawed, malicious, broken, wrong, or dangerous in ways that become difficult if the player has more direct control over how that character gets expressed or what their personality is. Meanwhile, the other tradition of player characters traces the roots of their design back to pen and paper role-playing games. The fundamental differences between these characters and the player characters as avatars is an emphasis on collaborative storytelling and empathetic role-playing. That is, the player is asked to step into the role of a character, to internalize their thought process and behave like them, and are given mechanics and choices that allow them to enact that performance in the space of the game. The breadth of player expression with these characters can vary. In a lot of instances, they are, in the truest sense of the word, player-generated characters. Players can determine their gender, their appearance, their skills, their playstyle. Players are sometimes encouraged to write a bit of backstory for these characters to help solidify a context, history, and motivation for their behaviors. Again, games with a direct line to pen and paper RPGs. But other times, for narrative or other reasons, players may not be able to fully define the character, but that doesn't mean they aren't expressive. Take Tyranny, where the player has to, definitionally, be a high-ranking commander in the evil army that does evil things for the evil lord's will, but it's how that character deals with that position that really drives the narrative and defines the character. Or look at Planescape Torment, where the players take on the role of the Nameless One, a character with a set physicality, an appearance, and gender, and starting playstyle, and even a bit of set history. But from there, players can control what sort of person the Nameless One becomes, how he solves problems, and what the ultimate conclusion to his story is. It still invites you into his headspace, and it still gives you the expressive space to figure out who this person is, and for you to behave like them. These are games that tend to emphasize player choice as an expressive act with an eye towards minimizing the distance between the player and the character. These expressions can come about in any number of ways, and there's a whole myriad of role-playing systems that we could talk about.
They shanked me, the bastards! The blood ain't working no more. My head, it feels cracked. Oh, I think my eyes popped. All right. Jeez, you think you were the one laying here with his guts hanging out?
I'm not going to get into all of them here, but let's go over the usual. There's stat systems that allow you to describe a character that has specific strengths and weaknesses. You could have a ninja character that's great at sneaking and melee combat, but terrible at haggling with vendors for a good price or romancing people. Or you could have a super charismatic genius who is terrible at combat and tries to just talk their way out of as many problems as possible. It's a way to systemically codify a character's skills, training, behavior, interests, or abilities by allowing them to have strengths and, critically, weaknesses. Another approach may be dialogue trees that allow you to express your character's views in-game and have the world react to those views in kind. You could flirt with the lady at the club or be all business.
Oh, I'm not frightening you, am I, duckling? I can tell you and I are going to get along just like fire hoses. When we get turned on, there's bound to be flames. You smell new, little girl, like fabric softener do on freshly mowed AstroTurf. Oh, I'm not frightening you, am I, duckling? Oh, I was just thinking about this delicious little pancake who came into my club and wasn't so sweet because she was soaked in vinegar.
Or you could have your character threaten the schlubby nighttime guard or just sneak into the art house unseen with feats of strength. Stats help determine your character through their actions and abilities, but dialogue options and how the game responds to them help you define your character's place in the game world, their position relative to other people, and how they're seen. Finally, there may be narrative choices or quests with multiple endings that have an impact on the narrative, your character literally shaping the world and the story around them, less as an expression of character than as an actual act of collaborative storytelling. The point is that the game wants you to express a character through choices, and that choice is validated not through the observation of a game master or your peers, like in pen and paper role-playing games, but by the system tipping its hat and accommodating your choices, by having the other characters in the world respond to the decisions you make. Now, this approach to player characters tends to be less common in computer games. Like we discussed earlier, single-player role-playing games are something of an aberration, and so you don't see them as often as you do in multiplayer or pen and paper games. But they do exist, and they're some of my favorite titles. There's a distinct pleasure in the creativity involved in sculpting a whole person using the context of the game as a springboard, and there's also a pleasure in the performance itself. To be the strong, if dim, brute who critically bungles a simple conversation check, but then beats his way out of the room regardless of how many enemies he makes.
Would you please use your special talents and rid my garden of the plants of dark soul? May your aura grace my presence when you are... Oh, come to my door when you're done and I'll give you something good.
Or to be the smartass super science hacker that is obnoxious and worthless in a fight, who survives just by running away from almost any encounter, even if it's one he antagonized his way into. There's a perverse joy in trying to think of the way those characters would think, to internalize their motivations and see the world as they might, however briefly, and then to have the game reflect those decisions in the game space. It's a beautiful dance, but it's hard to get right, and it's also one that's kind of a hard sell to mainstream audiences. It's fun, but it's a dorky kind of fun that's hard to get people to just spend a Saturday night doing. And yeah, I think historically those are the two approaches you may have seen to designing player characters, with player characters as avatars far more common than the expressive role-playing kind. But recently I think we've seen the emergence of a new philosophy regarding how to approach player characters, and it's one that seems to have cropped up primarily, though not exclusively, in big budget games trying to integrate role-playing mechanics for their longevity while still providing a scripted cinematic narrative. And this is the idea of what I'm going to sloganeer and call the role-flexible player character, a sort of player character that imparts a degree of player authorship, but not enough to fundamentally alter who this character is. You've seen this approach to player characters all over blockbuster games lately. You are Alexios or Cassandra, grandchild of Leonidas, and the magical assassin bloodline runs through you. You are Geralt of Rivia, witcher trained to hunt monsters, beasts, and demons in exchange for coin, and despite your gruff exterior, you find yourself emotionally attached to the people in your life. You are Adam Jensen, security guard in love with Megan, who was brutally injured on an attack at his day job and given a robot body he famously never asked for. You are Aloy, the outcast Nora woman who has some unknown connection to the technology of the Ancient Ones. These are characters with set personalities, set attributes, set worldviews, set characterizations. They have extensive speaking roles where voice actors convert their take on the character into the delivery.
Any final lessons before I head in?
No. You've learned every lesson the Wilds have to teach.
It was you who taught me, not the Wilds.
They are definitively not the player's creation, and they are fully formed when you, the player, arrive to take over their role. But they are also undeniably bendy, flexible, able to be toyed with a bit.
Yeah, why don't you tell us a little more about yourself, Lee?
Where are you from?
I grew up in Macon.
Right here in the heart of Georgia.
Adam Jensen can be insolent about his augmentations, or he can be indifferent. Your version of Geralt may always get his coin, or he may violate that rule in the name of the greater good. Your Alexios can sleep around most of Greece, or they could be largely chaste. Your Aloy can have moments of mercy or moments of short-tempered determination. These aren't roles you create, they're pre-written roles that you get to slip into, but the games intentionally provide you with the expressive space to make them your own a little bit. Think of it as an actor who's allowed to have a little fun with the character as written. You can ad-lib a line or two or come up with an affect, but you're not going to escape what's written on the page. And I feel like this represents something of a new approach to designing player characters that we haven't seen much of before, because it takes ideas from the role-playing approach and sort of warps what those mechanics are used for. Unlike player characters as avatars, players do take some degree of ownership over expressing these characters, and there's an attempt to break down that distancing wall between the player and the character, at least a little bit.
Did you find my brother? Where is he?
He didn't survive. I'm sorry.
No, no, no!
To save his own life, he chose to work for the pirates. They would have killed him otherwise. There was nothing I could do.
What? My brother would rather die than work for pirates. Pirates killed our father last summer. He shaded everything about the sea since then. Tell me the truth!
Your brother's dead. I didn't want to.
You dare!
Assassin's Creed Odyssey doesn't really give you the option to roleplay, but it does give you the option to make Alexios kind of a dick. But at the same time, these games are not about facilitating collaborative storytelling where players guide the narrative itself, or even just allowing players to sculpt the character through their choices. Like, let's break down some of these mechanics and how they're fundamentally different from the role-playing approach. For example, I get the sense that a lot of modern dialogue trees exist as a way to dole out exposition in a way that feels less lore-dumpy. Instead of an unskippable 20-minute cutscene where we have two talking heads going back and forth about the history of the game universe to lay it all out there, and instead of burying it all in some sort of codex or quest log, developers give players a baseline spiel with the option to reach out for additional dialogue as needed. Traditional role-playing games do this too, of course, but those games also use their dialogue systems for other things, character expression or stat-based dialogue skill checks to pull off conversational feats. But because the modern AAA characters are static in their expression, and because skills are more of the open-world variety these days, those aren't present here. The choices are just exposition navigation. It's less simulating a conversation than it is navigating a wiki page for lore. But that's not to say they don't have any expressive dialogue options. Take, for example, this exchange between Vesemir and Geralt.
A crossbow. Won it in a card game while you ran around. Might come in handy.
Do we chastise Vesemir for gambling, or do we make fun of him for handing us a decidedly non-witchery weapon? Both options feel more or less appropriate for the character, and they have literally no impact to the story.
How about that? Always lectured us on the evils, but you're a gambler yourself. Stop talking. Got a griffin to kill. A witcher with a crossbow? We breaking with tradition? Stop talking. Got a griffin to kill.
I would argue this isn't really a role-playing option per se, but it's shaped like one. For one, the game doesn't respond to the choice in any way. Vesemir doesn't even respond differently. It's also not really so much about making a choice from the mindset of the character. It isn't asking you to be Geralt and make an informed role-playing decision from his mindset. Instead, it's more asking what you would like to see happen next. If it is an expressive choice at all, it's an expression of your interest and thoughts on the situation, not Geralt's. At its most effective, these sorts of choices allow you to explore different angles of a set character by slightly altering the dialogue, to unearth various sides of their personality, or to bounce certain quips off of the person you're responding to. Horizon Zero Dawn, for example, has, at various points along the game, the option for Aloy to respond to characters in different ways. The game literally defines these as an inconsequential choice based on various aspects of her personality that are totally up to you to explore. Aloy can use her intellect, or Aloy can show her compassion, or Aloy can show her vengeance. None of these choices really alters her character in any profound way because she shows all of these attributes throughout the game, but letting you select her response lets you shade her a bit towards whatever of her personality traits you like the best. It's potentially a really neat way to poke at a character's edges without giving up authorship. Dialogue choices in these games are less about expressing a character than they are about exploring the text, whether that's optional lore and exposition, or exploring how a character may interact with others. Another key mechanic co-opted from role-playing games, but then stripped of its expressive nature, are modern skill systems. These are endemic to open-world titles these days, and I've bemoaned them before in games like Fallout 4. Basically, we no longer sculpt a character that has strengths and weaknesses, but instead get presented with a series of abilities, typically from 3 tiers for some reason, open to the character, and simply pick the order in which they are unlocked. There's no such thing as a character who is bad at things and good at other things, just characters who have a set list of abilities and aren't the best at some things yet. Everyone's Alexios or Cassandra were stealthy assassins who were also bold warriors, who were also expert marksmen with a bow and arrow. The only question is the order in which you became hyper-proficient in each of those categories. Much like in the player character as avatar approach, it feels like the ideal versions of these characters already have all these powers. We just need to grind up enough to live up to them. Finally, there's the aspect of narrative choice. In player character as avatar games, you don't really have them. In games where player characters take after pen and paper role-playing characters, narrative choices come about as a consequence of the character's influence in the game world. But much like the dialogue options, decisions in these recent games aren't really driven by the player making decisions as a character. Who you save at the end of the first chapter of The Walking Dead is more of a who do you like more choice than a who would Lee Everett save in this scenario choice. Big narrative choices in these games are there to make the player feel like they matter to the game world, not the characters themselves. And that's the thing that tends to unite all of these mechanics and how they're used in this role-play flexible system. They're centered not on role-playing, but on the player choosing an outcome that's favorable to them as a player/person. They don't engage players with the inner workings and belief systems of their pre-scripted characters, but instead occasionally allow players an indulgence of control. They're role-playing choices stripped of the roleplay. But at the same time, maybe this is how you fit that square peg into the round hole. It's no longer about the validation of a performance, but about exploring a pre-written text, which is what digital games are really more suited to. And the process can produce fleshed out, well-written player characters that we feel more attached to and have some sense of ownership over, while still allowing them to have the integrity of an authored arc. So those are what I would argue are the current 3 dominant approaches to player characters in story-driven single-player games. There's probably even more that could be said about games where player characters are even more abstract, like Civilization or Alpha Centauri, or where the relationship between your play and the characters on the screen is more complicated than a one-to-one relationship like in, say, The Sims. Again, none of this is meant to be authoritative, concrete, or complete, more like researched musings to get us talking about all this stuff. I feel like the use and applications of player characters is an underexplored concept. Like Rules of Play said, you step into a role whenever you play a game. That role recontextualizes your relationship with everything around you. Thinking about how that role is structured can help us understand how that recontextualization works in the systems we build, the stories we tell, and the characters we explore.